Everybody to the Lao China Institute's latest webinar in our book launch series. And today we're here to welcome our very own Dr. Kostas Tsimonis to launch his new book, The Chinese Communist Youth League. For those attending today's session, we have a special 50% off discount, which is available throughout May, and I'll be posting that link shortly in the chat. I'd ask everybody to remain on mute until the end, where we will have time for Q&A. And I'll now introduce our chair for today's session, who's our leading China scholar, Professor Julia Strauss from SOAS University of London, to introduce Dr. Tsimonis to present his book before we go into the Q&A. So make sure you have your questions ready for that. Welcome, Professor Strauss.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be able to introduce Kostas because I have a very personal interest in Kostas. Kostas and I have known each other for approximately forever, and he was my first PhD student that was my student, as opposed to one that I inherited from people who moved on from SOAS. So it's absolutely wonderful to be able to introduce Kostas at this particular event, a first monograph that was a long time in coming and entirely worth the wait. Kostas is, as you all know, from Greece. His first degree was at Pantheon University in Athens, and then he came to SOAS and did an MSc in Asian politics and made the mistake of taking my postgraduate class and then liking it. And he said, what can I do to get a PhD? And I said, well, you got to go and have research capable Chinese before you can be let in. And he said, okay. And much to my surprise, he actually went off and got research capable Chinese, came back a few years later and did a PhD that was passed with flying colors in the politics department. The PhD dissertation was the core of this book, but only the initial meat. Much work was done subsequently. Kostas is currently a lecturer in Chinese society at the Lao China Institute at King's. And before that, he was a teaching fellow. Before that, he kind of bounced back and forth with varying teaching fellowship positions between SOAS and the Lao Institute, which means that there was a certain path that was very well worn between King's and SOAS. He's the king of walking around Bloomsbury. He has more grants and awards than you can shake a stick at. I won't go through them all, but the highlights include, there's one from the UN, there's one from Transparency International Defense Corruption, as well as the usual suspects like the Leverhulme Small Grant. He has many peer-reviewed articles, many of them now on Belt and Road, so a real shift sideways into other more immediately pressing questions of policy. But this is the real big. I'm gonna hold it up. This is the book. It's absolutely beautiful. Chinese Communist Youth League, Juniority, and Responsiveness in a Party Youth Organization. Kudos to the production team for coming up with such a gorgeous, gorgeous book. Expensive, but gorgeous. So if there's anyone here who can make recommendations to a library other than KCL's or SOAS's, please recommend it, because this really is something that any institution that teaches on Chinese domestic politics really should have. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Kostas, who's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes. And from there, we will take questions. I'll moderate the questions. Okay, over to you, Kostas.
Thank you very much, Professor Strauss. I'm really grateful that you have agreed to chair this event. Thank you, Anna, for organizing everything for today. And thank you all for coming. I'm really humbled by your presence. There is, of course, one key element missing for a successful book launch, and that's cheap wine, the kind of wine King's Catering specializes in. But I hope that you will still find it, you will find this event worth attending. So let me share my screen. Now, there is always a story behind the things we research, and mine starts with my own involvement in student politics during my undergraduate studies in Greece, since which I have lost two things. The first is any belief in communism, and the other you can tell just by looking at the photo of my student ID. So back in 2003, in the good old years of soft authoritarianism, I went to China for the first time. And almost immediately after arriving, I took the subway to visit Tiananmen Square. Back then, the Beijing subway system was very frugal, right? It only had three lines. So on my way out of Tiananmen Station, I noticed this sign, which points to the exit closer to the Communist Youth League Central Committee. And it immediately got my attention. My cheap hotel was located above a McDonald's, so in my still very untrained eye, there was a clear contradiction. The communist youth organizations I knew back home were very activist, anti-capitalist, and would jump in the opportunity to confront the riot police. So what was the Chinese Communist Youth League's role in this capitalist and authoritarian regime? As I embarked in postgraduate studies at SOAS, I became very interested in the literature on civil society in China, especially on labor and gender. What fascinated me were the struggles by the trade unions and the Women's Federation to stay relevant to their social constituencies under very difficult and contradictory conditions. Now, that rich literature contained many interesting stories of smaller and bigger initiatives by cadres in these organizations aiming at promoting the interests of their social constituencies. The Women's Federation, in particular, was a bastion of social entrepreneurship by cadres at the grassroots, and also of institution building and advocacy at the national level. Now, the trade unions, the Communist Youth League and the Women's Federation are the party's mass organizations and are jointly referred to as the Gongqing Fu. Now, but the literature on the League was either old, so a couple of publications from the 1960s and 1970s, or they were referring to factionalism in elite politics, and especially the so-called Tuantai that was so popular in the Hu and Wen decade. So there was a clear empirical gap from the state society perspective on the Communist Youth League. Now, more important than this empirical gap was the continuous absence of Chinese youth from politics since 1989. Simply put, where are they? Has the Chinese Communist Party managed to tame this very powerful force of 20th century Chinese politics? Or perhaps young people are satisfied with the party or simply tolerate the regime? Are they supportive or apathetic? Now, this book examines a mass organization that remains understudied in both English and Chinese. It approaches the League from a state society perspective, not elite politics, and builds on my PhD research that looked at the efforts of the League to increase its responsiveness during the Hu and Wen decade, which was also a period of expansion of social services in China. The book has, of course, expanded both the empirical and conceptual aspects of that research, and is linking this effort under Hu with three main discussions. The first one is has to do with Xi Jinping, right? Everything right now has to do with Xi Jinping. What is the rationale between Xi's kind of conservative youth policies and especially the downgrading of the League at the national and local levels since he took power? Is it simply due to factional considerations? Perhaps we need to be asking what went wrong during the previous decade that prompted C to punish the Communist Youth League and bring the party more direct control of youth affairs. Secondly, what are the pillars of youth support for the regime? Is this support ephemeral and conditional, based primarily on some sort of combination of fear, nationalism, successful performance of the economy that the regime has employed to sustain public support more broadly? Or can the party's youth organization cultivate support through successful socialization and more responsive engagement with young people? And of course, what are the implications of failing to do that? And third, there is a comparative dimension, which links the Chinese case with discussions on youth alienation from politics, even beyond the authoritarianism and democracy kind of divide. The book develops the concept of juniority, a form of subordination that is distinct from institutional dependency and which merges political control and generational authority, and explains how and why juniority undermines the impetus for responsiveness, which is actually a common feature of party youth organizations. The book's comparative dimension goes, in a way, it goes the opposite way from what we are used to. So instead of applying a concept from Western political science into the Chinese context, it builds a concept up from a Chinese case and claims that it has a comparative analytical value for other authoritarian regimes, but also possibly for democratic politics. Now, the concept I employ in this investigation is juniority, which I define as the conditioning of youth as a junior political subject. My starting point in understanding youth is the feminist critique on the construction of women as a social category through power structures such as state institutions, the law, language. And of course, this is part of a broader scholarly inquiry on the ways by which human beings are made subjects, which of course applies to the construction of youth. Now, building on Bourdieu's understanding of youth as a construct, as a manipulated political subject, the concept of juniority captures the political dimension of intergenerational power relations. The manipulation of youth as a political subject is very clearly demonstrated in the age range of party youth organizations, which usually group together completely different social realities. In the case of the League, which was also the case for most communist youth organizations, that age group was between 14 or 15, sometimes to 28. So grouping together teenagers in schools with young professionals under a junior political identity. And of course, becoming a party member would symbolize political maturity. Now, juniority is conceptualized as a form of subordination that is distinct from institutional dependency, since it merges political control and generational authority. It is institutionalized and expressed in the set of norms, organizational practices, incentives that constitute youth as a junior political subject, whose interests and duties are top-down defined through hierarchies, hierarchically defined, that favor the structural position of more senior stakeholders in politics and society, including party committees, of course, and government departments, but also university authorities, employers, unions, and so on. Now, the League as a junior organization has no real ability, as we're going to see, to develop localized strategies for responsiveness and for innovation in youth policy. This incapacity produces widespread apathy and cynicism among young people and League members, and demotivates cadres who see little benefit in actually sustaining a commitment or developing a specialization in youth work. In consequence, juniority prevents the League from following the path of other mass organizations in China, which modestly adapted their work methods so that they could partially respond to the demands of their constituencies. In essence, the book shows how juniorizing youth as a political subject undermines the League's ability to engage young people and cost the League its appeal, even when the party actually wanted the League to become more responsive. Now, As a party-dependent organization, we could never, of course, expect the Communist Youth League to turn into an autonomous organization performing the functions of an NGO. We have seen, however, that other mass organizations have managed to negotiate their work territory and engage with their social constituencies. That's especially the case of the All China Women's Federation, that has undertaken various pro-women initiatives at the local and national level while remaining loyal to the party's patriarchal discourse and policies. The explanation of the League's failure lies in the way that youth is constructed as a political subject so as to create a condition of juniority for the CYL that impedes its own responsiveness. Now, this blending of generational with political authority has a particularly damaging effect in the micro level, that as it incapacitates cadres from developing a more responsive approach. Now, a recurrent theme in my investigation, in the interviews, is that the League has an inferior organizational status among government agencies and departments that in all cases was taking the visible form of young, less experienced cadres representing the League and being in disadvantageous positions within strong seniority-based hierarchies on campus, in the workplaces, in local government. So during fieldwork, individual cadres expressed concerns over the problems that young people faced, but also a sense of helplessness. Now, juniority in the League is sustained through organizational practices that affect cadre career paths, expectations, incentives, priorities. In 1982, the party codified regulations on age limits in League positions, which in effect replicate League cadreship as a junior position in the micro level. So this organizational practice essentially means that a position in the League is always equal to an entry-level post, especially for those part-time and ordinary cadres, or in preparation for promotion to the party and government for full-time and leading cadres, like the committee secretary. Now, grassroots cadres, who are usually in their 20s, are not only junior to party committees, but also occupy a low position in academic and workplace hierarchies, respectively, which means that they lack the experience and social capital within their place of study or work to support and effectively promote any kind of pro-youth initiatives. So in the case of unions, labor unions were quite, the ones that I contacted, they were quite geared towards the interests of older workers rather than of young workers. And the League had a really hard time, League cadres had a really hard time to actually shifting its attention to the interests of younger employees. Now, in this respect, juniority bounds agency as cadres are constantly in a position of institutional weakness, not only in their political post, but also in the academic, workplace, hierarchies, to negotiate internally for new initiatives affecting youth. Now, leading cadres in full-time positions, usually as local secretaries, are also party committee members with the youth portfolio, and their career trajectory leads them to the party state. There is no prospect of a career in the League or in youth affairs, and therefore no incentive to develop specialization and commitment to youth work. Essentially, the League serves youth as a junior political identity, rather than as a widely varied social constituency. Now, the plot of the book starts in July 2003, when Hu Jintao, speaking at a conference of League cadres, encouraged them to work hard to keep the party at ease and the youth satisfied. I love this slogan because it captures really the challenge of the League, but also the party more broadly. Now, the next day, the Communist Youth League constitution was revised, adding among its roles helping the government in managing youth affairs. So next to its traditional tasks, of administering the process of party membership, cultivating loyalty, mobilizing young people, indoctrinating them, expanding the network of branches and organizations to cover new social spaces and groups, the League would now have to do all sorts of new things, introduce locally social services such as youth hotlines and psychological support and participatory processes, open meetings with young people. It would have to expand youth infrastructure, create youth centers in urban and rural neighborhoods, also online discussion networking forums, introducing new activities. It was also expected to promote and implement youth laws and policies at the local and national level, and even collaborate with social organizations. Now, all this, of course, took the form of unfunded mandates. So the idea was that by increasing its responsiveness, the League would become more appealing to young people and therefore cultivate legitimacy for the regime. Now, the book covers the work of the League on campuses, workplaces, mainly state organizations and public companies, as well as in local and national level government. After the first two chapters that developed the book's plot and analytical framework, I turned to the examination of the League's activities in its key spaces of operation, so in universities and places of work, and secondarily in private enterprises, so mainly in relation to university students and young employees. Now, the second half explores the League's training policies and various nationwide campaigns, its youth work and volunteerism, searching for evidence of responsiveness. Now, it would take a lot of time to present all kind of empirical findings. In the period, so I've made this balance sheet. Now, so in the period under examination, there were some achievements, but mainly these achievements were superficial and short-lived. So we did have an increase in members and branches. There was, this tendency to measure success in quantitative terms. Locally, we had more activities than ever. Locally and nationally, we had lots of different activities initiated by the League, or better, in which the League was participating and perhaps presenting as its own. There was involvement in new areas of work, including youth employment, which is very important to young Chinese. However, through my closer kind of investigation, a different kind of picture emerged. So in terms of the League's actual reach, we had very extensive nominal membership and declining participation. So in my surveys, I found that only around 20% of students participated in League activities at least once every 3 months. And outside education, the League's presence was mainly nominal. There was also an overall expansion of activities, but that did not improve the degree of responsiveness. So the League was doing more, but was not doing better. It had a very weak ability to articulate and promote locally a youth agenda. The big majority of the work of the League was involved, it was initiated by other departments and was in most cases unrelated to young people and their welfare. So this was, the League fell in the trap of the generalists doing everything and nothing. In the few instances that youth welfare related campaigns actually took place, they took the form of unfunded mandates and often led to failures. For example, there was this campaign to open up youth centers because, of course, any kind of youth-related infrastructure, including the children's palaces and so on, a Soviet institution that existed also in the Maoist era, had been weakened. Basically, there was no youth infrastructure in cities. So there was a campaign to open up youth centers, the Qingni and Zhongxin, in local communities. And since there were no funds and not enough cadres, what happened was simply that local committees were putting up signs same youth centers in local communal facilities. So you would get the same space being a youth center, a senior citizen center, a local community center, but it was usually occupied by pensioners, like playing mahjong. In terms of cadres, there was actually very minimal improvement in specialized youth training. There was an expansion of the league's training institutions, but very little when it came to youth training. Cadre initiative was sporadic and short-lived. There was an overall sense of helplessness of how to engage in social work. And the league overall failed to promote specialization in youth affairs. What really surprised me was that this sense of helplessness existed also at the national level. So I managed to actually get access to the Communist Youth League Central Committee building, a very Stalinist kind of building with no charm whatsoever. But in talking to people there, they admitted there was actually very little they could do about young people. As more senior bureaucracies, I'm not referring only to the party, the Ministry of Education, but also the Women's Federation, another mass organization, defined the youth agenda. They had captured the youth agenda and had sidelined the League in youth policy. Also, the League limited its interaction with very few official and state-sponsored organizations. And this created, of course, a very big gap in its knowledge about its social environment. Now, also its social work reflected an elitism with a preference on urban-based students and a clear distancing from youth groups that were not viewed as advanced, so marginalized youth or migrant youth. And of course, young people responded accordingly. In surveys, I found an overwhelming majority of students that said that the League had to improve its youth work, that did not represent its interests. Young employees largely ignored League activities as there was very low participation. Local initiatives failed to generate any interest to bring people together. But aside from young people, this situation did not go unnoticed by people within the party. So, of course, 2012, she came in, and in the couple of years after taking power, he started criticizing repeatedly. In the beginning, more softly, but then more directly, he started criticizing the League. In 2016, he also sent a CCDI, the Central Committee for Discipline Inspection Group, which concluded that the League had become bureaucratic, procedurally minded, aristocratic, and entertainment-oriented. And this provided the background for the 2016 reform plan. That involved drop in funding and in grassroots organizations, reduction of top ranks, weakening control over training institutions, over businesses, as well as volunteer programs. And it was also reflected at the grassroots level with an effort by the party to assume more direct control over student affairs on campus. These are developments of the last year, and I am examining those in a forthcoming article which I co-author with Jérôme Doyon. So, in conclusion, the effort to keep the youth satisfied under WHO was an overall failure, as it did not manage to attract young people's interest or to materialize a new approach to youth policy with emphasis on participation and social services provision. So at the time when the League was building up its reputation and strength as a career accelerator for ambitious cadres, it was also totally unfit to deal with youth affairs. Now, going into the CR era, one could argue that the League's reform provided a good opportunity for C to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, weaken the institutional basis of actual or potential opponents in the Tuan Pai, and on the other, implement his vision for a more disciplined corps of cadres. And so under a political plan that placed emphasis on discipline, loyalty, a renewed promise by the party to better serve the Chinese nation, the League has to emerge as an organization where the China dream is internalized by young generations. Now, bringing the work of the League closer to young people, of course, would be a very desirable development. But the combination of reduced capacity and status with a stricter political environment under C will very likely result in the League's retrenchment. It will become more red, but possibly more irrelevant for young people. We've seen that case of moving from liberal to more conservative kind of approaches to youth so many times in the history of Soviet and former socialist regimes. In addition, further weakening the political standing and career prospects of youth League cadres will enhance the League's juniority. As such, it's very unlikely that C's reform will create the conditions necessary for more effective and responsive and engagement with young people. I mean, C wants the League closer to people, but closer not in terms of responding to their demands, or at least responding to what he sees as the legitimate demands of youth. So far, Xi Jinping's recipe for renewal is inspired by China's past, shows no potential for promoting the League's professionalization, specialization, and any kind of commitment to youth affairs. Now, in closing, I mean, the construction of youth as a junior political subject exceeds the historical context and experiences of China and even of communist regimes. The attention to young age that emerged with industrialization and modern nation-state developed practices, institutions, and spaces that aimed at the systematic construction of youth as a junior political subject. Now, age limits for citizenship, ascribed youth social attributes, codes of proper social, individual, sexual behavior, education systems, all these designated youth as a subject that's politically loyal and generationally subordinated. Nowadays, of course, we see that many democracies have been confronted with an increasing trend of young people's disassociation from formal politics, expressed in low voting rates or expressed in support for all sorts of populist parties. So one could only think that if the rejection of mainstream politics is a common problem under both authoritarianism and democratic regimes, one cannot but wonder whether there are possible common causes. Indeed, young people, both in China and the West, express cynical attitudes and often abstain from formal politics. They reject youth organizations, unions, political parties, and do not participate in local affairs and elections. Can the mechanisms of juniorizing youth bear more similarities than differences, thereby creating similar forms of political alienation? Now, of course, the intentions of such a comparison is not to minimize the reconcilable differences between authoritarianism and democracy, but to closely examine the ways in which modern societies politically alienate youth with a view to improving the appeal of democratic institutions. So, thank you. I hope I didn't bore you.
Kostas, that was far from boring. It was an absolutely wonderful presentation. Somebody might have their microphone on because I'm getting a bit of an echo. I think that perhaps the best way to proceed would be for people to put their questions in the chat because Teams is such that it's very difficult to see everyone who might be raising their hand. One can only see about 5 participants in the group at a time. So I would invite you to type in to the chat your questions, And I will start off with chair's privilege, I guess, by asking Kostas. Kostas, is there, you've described very well the question, the problem of alienation, the widespread sense of alienation in different political systems. But in your experience of interviewing so many different people in China having to do with the Communist Youth League, is there any sense that you got that individuals themselves who are youth falling in the right age bracket consider themselves to be a corporate group or have a corporate identity as youth? Or is this simply a construct that has taken on a life of its own because of the way in which mass organizations were formed, starting in the as part of the Chinese Revolution, starting in the 1920s, and then becoming very much institutionalized in the early 1950s? Is this notion of youth simply a historical imaginary artifact, or do people themselves identify in any way as youth?
Okay, excellent question to begin the Q&A. Well, I will respond with an example. So a cadre that that I got to know, and in the process we also hung out a bit, and he was getting quite. He was at a stage of his career, so he was in the mid-30s. And he started getting his first white hair. And he was worried about that because that meant that he was getting late for his promotion. So the end of his youth, this has a performative kind of aspect as well. So the end of youth for him meant that he had to move on from all the youth and volunteer kind of stuff that he was very active with during, it was also the time of the Beijing Olympics. And he had to go on and do a more mature kind of job. So what I find interesting, to answer your question, is that there is an internalization of this top-down youth identity, which is, of course, the product of very long historical socialization with what youth means. And this, in turn, this is a good example of how this identity essentially undermines the effort for more responsiveness. The who and when decade is very interesting because the party was telling the league to do something. It was, become more open, like more engaged, more contact youth, and so on. And then I would go to places like, I don't know, in Haidien, talk to party, to league officials and ask them, okay, so what kind of social organizations are you in contact with? I would say, we are not. I said, okay, how many are there in your district? We're not sure. They were completely cut off. For them, youth was a stage in their political life, in their political career that they had to get rid of quickly in order to move on.
Okay, terrific. We have a question from Carrie Brown. Do you think the Youth League is connected to a political faction, as was often maintained a few years ago, with Hu and then Li Keqiang claiming to be the head of this faction? Do you think that this faction has real meaning in it? Or is there another way of understanding this?
Well, I'm not the best person to talk about factional politics, but in my understanding, from the cadre's perspective, definitely the league is their place of work for around a decade. So it's we know that how networks of loyalty are formed in those environments. So I don't think it is a faction in the sense of, I don't know, the ERG in the Tory party. It's not so well well organized. I think that the League definitely provides the platform for different factions and networks to be formed. So did who? I think what happened with who was that he was having the support of some people within that had League experience, with whom he worked with, he met, and so on during his years in the League. But I would doubt the idea that we have a clear-cut faction or that it is a two-dimensional situation where you have this, where you have the Tuan Pai, you have the Shanghai faction, and so on.
Great.
And to a certain degree, I think this is also true for Li Keqiang.
Okay, great question from Jérôme Doyon. Particularly liking the idea that redness may be counter to relevance. So Jerome was wondering if you could expand on the issue of juniority and responsiveness. In particular, are there any exceptions, any instances where we actually do see some level of responsiveness coming from the Youth League?
Okay, very good question. Well, the answer is yes. So there were what I found was a lot of impetus for change, right? Because especially young people, they want to change things. So, but there was a very low ceiling in what they could do. The exception to that case was the China was an institution, a research institution, the China Youth Research Center in Beijing, which was set up as a research entity. And so for that reason, I mean, it was sponsored by the League. Officially, it was sponsored by the League. But so it could develop this specialization in youth affairs necessary. Right. But its interaction with the League was minimal. I mean, they would ask grassroots organizations occasionally to distribute surveys, but still you would get the feeling that, I mean, they are researchers, academics, some of them doing their stuff, and the League is doing something else.
Mm-hmm. Great. Question from Louise Tillin. Louise was intrigued to know more about universities as institutional spaces of protest and dissent. And her question is, was the sidelining of youth as an independent political category also about neutralizing universities as locations for dissent and protest?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There were clear efforts after 1989, when was the big burst of youth kind of rebelliousness. There was a very conscious effort on bringing everyone back to class, sending them for a month or so in military training, and doing their best to depoliticize the campus. So I think that the downside to that, so in a way to cultivate apathy, right? So the downside to that, which is what Jérôme and I are looking in this new article, is perhaps it went way too into the apathy side. Perhaps it created too much apathy, and so Xi Jinping is now trying to remobilize youth and bring them closer to the party. So yeah, it was to a certain extent, it was like a conscious effort.
Okay. Question from Yiqin Huang. Yiqin asks that there's some confusion about the conclusion, as you suggested, that there's no sign that the Youth League provides a sense of institutional support for the regime. And Yiqin wanted a little bit more of elaboration on this point and your empirical basis for this conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Good. So thank you, Itin, for letting me clarify. So with what I mean by institutional support. So there is a type of support where you where you cultivate legitimacy through your performance, right? Through the economy, through the fact that living standards are rising and so on, through nationalism. Okay, the parties seems to be delivering on the nationalist promises. And there is the kind of support that you create by providing solutions to everyday problems by addressing social issues. And that's where the league is failing. So it hasn't actually been able to do that. It was impossible exactly because it was serving more the idea of youth of the party rather than the social reality of youth. Right. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Sun Chin. Sorry, Sun Xin. I can't believe it. Congratulations. And Xin's question is that you seem to have argued that the Youth League fails to engage with youth, but is there an implication of such a failure? Is youth also losing confidence in the party?
Okay. So Xin is a political economist, so I'm sure he wants to see some data on that as well. I would say there is no indication that there is no clear indication that the party is losing support among young people. However, we have seen in the cases of Me Too, or in the case of the Marxist students supporting workers, we have seen some empirical evidence of a youth that is there. It is being politicized. They have their kind of views that don't correspond to the party. The fact that the league fails to support, fails to engage youth in a meaningful way, it doesn't directly mean that the party is going to suffer. It means that it's the youth support will remain more conditional upon factors that the party cannot necessarily control, like the performance of the economy or whether there's going to be a national crisis, right? And kind of nationalist reactions.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have about another 10 minutes. Are there any other questions that people might have? These have been absolutely terrific questions.
Fantastic questions. Yeah.
I'd like to invite others who have not written anything in the chat to please come forward, because we do have a bit more time. Going once, going twice. Okay, I would like to, I guess, conclude with a final, more speculative question for Kostas. You hinted that you're going to be writing another article on the question of youth. So I guess my question is, where do you see your research on Chinese youth and the Youth League going in the future? Obviously, some of this is conditional on what happens with the Xi Jinping regime, but you're continuing to work on this. It's not like now that the book is out, you're going to forget about it and just do other things. So where do you see the big questions, and where do you see your current and future investigation into these problems of apathetic youth and political control and mass organizations going in the future?
Wow, great question. Well, I think that if I'm fortunate enough to stay in academia and have a long career in academia, I will always be looking at what's going on with the Communist Youth League. And that, because I think that's the main kind of institutional aspect in the regime's relation with young people. Right now, of course, I'm very interested in how Xi Jinping is upsetting the balance, is upsetting the relationship between the party, the league, and young people, and what are the repercussions of that going to be. So in the article that hopefully will be out soon, we are saying that Xi Jinping is partifying the campuses at the expense of the league, not only creating a more politicized environment, but actually we have a party that is taking or aspires to take more and more control of things that the league used to do. So I think that in the future, a lot is going to depend on how Xi Jinping's political experiment with partification is going to develop.
Mm-hmm. If I can follow up just briefly, is there? It sounds to me like, if you look at your conclusion, that the problems with the league have been not only juniority, but bureaucracy, being top down, lack of responsiveness, being didactic in a way. But it seems to me that the Chinese Communist Party with partification is going to be doing exactly the same things, only more so. So is there any indication that these tactics, if they're taken over by a party rather than youth league, are going to fare any better with engaging youth?
No, and there hasn't been an example. This conservative turn is something that the Communist Party of China, but also communist parties in other parts of the former socialist world have been doing. So what's happening is that they start with a conservative approach, of course, after the revolution. Then they feel that young people are getting bored. They don't show up in meetings. They go to churches, as is one in Eastern Europe. They're doing other things. And then they say, okay, let's have a more liberal kind of approach. Usually this coincides with more liberal party leaderships. And then they are irritated by this degree of freedom that they have introduced, and then they turn back to the more conservative recipe. This has never worked.
It's never worked. Right. Okay. So on that somewhat sobering note, if there are no other questions, I would like to bring this wonderful presentation to a close. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this book launch. I'm going to hold it up one more time if you haven't seen it, if you've come in late. It's absolutely beautiful. Please do consider getting it at this terrific discount. It's an expensive book, but the discount really, really helps. It's a terrific achievement, and it's extremely thought-provoking, not just because it's not just about the Youth League in China in one particular phase. Although that is the meat of some of the chapters, it really spreads beyond to in a comparative dimension, but also for thinking about China as a whole. And I strongly encourage that you go out and you take a look at it. Hannah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Strauss. Thank you very much all for coming and for your very generous words.
Hannah, do you have any final conclusions?
Just thank you so much, Professor Strauss, and congratulations, Kostas, from everyone at the Lao and the broader King's community. We will be sharing this recording online for anyone that missed it, and if we want to revisit the discussion. And thank you everyone so much who joined us today. And don't forget to jump online and grab a copy of the book while you can get the 50% off.
Okay, terrific.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.